It's your friend Will, and I'm here to give you a quick round breakdown of the historical miniatures game 15XX that I'm currently developing and playtesting. This is a narrative, skirmish-sized game that's inspired by the pike and shot Renaissance era. I had two great interests that are driving me to making this game. One is just a love of history, and particularly of the Renaissance era and what we saw in the evolution of warfare, or as some scholars termed it, the military revolution. It's a time period where you saw the quintessential figure of a knight in heavy plate armor, wielding heavy lances on big, terrifying horses, sharing the battlefield with firearms, with bristling hedges of men with pikes and pole arms, and I found them to be a very fascinating space. However, much like many of us, I don't have time to build, assemble, paint, and model not just one, but two big armies to give you the classic clashes in that era. However, I can commit, and I am interested in the time of development and the time to play at the table in a post-COVID world with my friends, these smaller skirmish games. Then the other driving interest is I'm a big role-playing game nerd, have always been. And so I've enjoyed games like Mordheim, Necromunda. In the past several years, you have games like Frostgrave and a whole host of others that have really embraced that narrative and role-playing game inspired aspect to their rules. And I wanted to bring that experience to the historical gaming space, specifically here in the Renaissance era, where I think you can have a wide variety of figure types that can give you some interesting varieties of what you see at the table, both visually, but then also in play style. So to give you the round breakdown, what we're going to do is give you an example of what a skirmish or what an encounter between two parties, which is what we call war bands in 15XX, might look like mid-game. So you'll see here that we've got a mix of figures and a mix of markers on the table. To give you the initial context, a party will usually have 4 different what we call groups. And a group is a specific kind of troop type. Common weapons, common tactics. A troop can range from a single base, which is what we see here, are reiters armed with wheel-lock pistols, kind of short-range cavalry sort of guys. And then we also see examples of bases where we'll get into once we get into the gameplay, but you see one here, and that is a figure of war dogs or hunting hounds. He also has 2 buddies that are currently off the board right now, but that's an example of a group that might have 3 bases. And likewise, we have 2 base units. You see here the carts. We have 2 bases of footmen with pikes, and then hidden in the rubble and behind the trees in the far edge here, we have a unit or a group of shot armed with calivers or arquebuses. However, we're representing this in the middle of gameplay just to speed up the round breakdown when we get into that. The other note that you are going to see, and we'll probably pick up on already if you're paying close attention, is that this game is played on a small board, 2x3, and it's built to run on a grid. Because personally, have never cared for the fiddliness and the rules lawyering that can sometimes happen with exacting measurements, bringing in the rulers, protractors, specific measuring tapes, etc. I've found that running this game on a grid, it gets us moving a lot faster and allows you to embrace the fun of the gameplay rather than worrying if you're an inch or a half inch or a quarter inch away. So the rounds, there are going to be 3 rounds or 3 phases of a larger round once you get into the encounter itself. There is a fog of war and first contact phase that happens at the beginning of every encounter that is really a mini game in and of itself, heavily inspired by the Two Fat Lardies in their Chain of Command game, which I think is a brilliant thing, which I'm heavily inspired by in that phase. When you get through that and your encounter has begun in earnest, you will move through 3 phases that circle back to the top of an initial initiative phase, and then you move into a movement phase, and then you have an action phase. And this is a modified you go, I go system, because I think it's also kind of speeds up gameplay, but we're making sure that there are opportunities for reactions and that casualties are handled after everybody's had a chance to move and act with their models, so that one team is not just fully obliterated and doesn't have a chance to respond and the player isn't having a lot of fun. So let's start at that initiative phase. The initiative phase is fundamentally a series of bookkeeping and narrative elements that lead into bidding for initiative. As you begin play, you will have a number of initiative tokens that are equal to the number of groups. As we've said, the standard party size in the game is 4 groups. However, your initiative tokens will be whittled down as the game progresses. So let's look at the situation we have here right now. The very first thing you do at the beginning of your contact phase is remove casualties. And if you'll see down here with my yet to be painted only primed markers, tragically in the last set of movement and action phases, the 2 carts have become casualties. So what we do here is we remove them from play, we set them off to the side. However, their casualty markers remain where they are taken off the board. To enforce the theme of Renaissance and early modern warfare, this was pillaging and it was inhumane, and you're going to lose your dignity if you are wounded and can't get off the battlefield, much less dead. You will be stripped. Your armor and equipment will be taken. And that's what we see happen here. So the casualty markers remain because we're simulating the middle of an encounter. We don't have any other units or casualties to worry about. So we move on to the next phase. Then it is checking which of your bases return to the fight. Because this is a small board, 2x3, even for the 15 millimeter scale figures that I'm playing with, the grid effectively makes that smaller. And so I wanted to emphasize the fact that what we see represented here on the table exists in a larger space. And this is really the where the raid, where the fighting, where the skirmish and scrapping and looting is happening. And your figures will often be pushed off of the board. When they are, they're not out of the fight. So, as I mentioned, we have more examples of our, even not zooming in with the camera, but we have more examples of our dogs. We have 2 bases that we will say have been run off the board in previous parts of the skirmish. So what we're going to do is for every base that you do not have on the board but is still in play, we're going to make a return to the fight check. And a return to the fight check is, much like every roll or every dice check in the game, is structured as X versus Y. Because you have 2 different groups of stats in the game. One is at a party level, and those are the stats of zeal, discipline, experience, and supply. Generally, the overall tone, tenor, and quality of the party and the larger group it may or may not represent. And then at a individual group level, you have group stats, which are more numerous than those 4 archetypical values. And so for the return to the fight check, for every base, you're going to make what we call a zeal versus a wits check, wits being one of the group level stats. And how this works is on your party roster. Here's the example of the one we are demoing right now and playtesting. Your party stats have a number value of 1 to 3. In this case, for my friends with the writer and the dogs and the carts that just got taken up, they have a zeal of 2. So that means I'm going to roll 2 10-sided dice. So 2 zeal versus wits. In this case, the dogs have wits of 2. So that means I need to roll on at least one success on either one of the dice I have available to roll. I need to roll a 2 or less to see if they return to the table this phase or not. Okay, so I rolled a 6 and an 8. So that means one of my bases of dogs do not return. Now I'm going to roll for the second base I have off the table. Whew, a 6 and a 10. Not looking good. Statistically, very improbable, but hey, that's dice for you. So right now, that means I only have one of my bases of the dogs and the riders. So I still have elements of 2 groups in play. So now I have removed units that have or groups that have become casualties. I've made checks to return to the fight, and now it's time for me to total my initiative tokens. So when you start play, as I mentioned, you're going to have 4 tokens each because you have 4 groups. However, we've gotten down to a point in the middle of this hypothetical encounter where we've been whittled down. If we're going to say our white tokens represent the pike and shot units on the far side of the camera, they've got 2 tokens because they have 2 groups left in play. And we have 2 groups left in play of the rider and the dogs. They would have had 3, but those cards, we removed them. Now they're down to 2. They have 2, even though there's only 1 base of the dogs on the table right now. Still counts. You get your tokens for it. So what we do next is we bid for initiative. Kind of hard when you're playing solo proof of concept as yourself, but here, let's just say that the white tokens, that player bids 2, and I would, if I'm playing the other side with these dark brown tokens, I reveal 1. So that means that the player, the pike and shot, has won the initiative. They can choose to move first or move second. In this game, it can often be beneficial to move second. Just depends on your strategy because we are using that modified you go, I go. However, what does the player with the brown tokens get? They bid and they lost. So they still retain all their tokens. They have 2 points. What you can do with your tokens as we get into the gameplay, you will see that you can spend them on reactions. You can also spend them to invoke some of the narrative elements of the game of your party's motivation and reputation. Your motivation is a set of kind of RP qualities that mechanically allow you to succeed on specific roles. And then likewise, your reputation is a set of RP-inspired qualities that will force a failure on the part of your opponents. And so you can spend your remaining initiative tokens on your invoking your motivation or reputation when it's appropriate, when you can. Also, you can use that to let one of your bases react to your opponent's moves. So we'll say that the player of the pike and shot on the far side of the table wants to go first. So we've successfully gone through the initiative phase, and now we will move to movement. As I said, this is a grid-based system. As you look closely, you can see the grid on the table. You can also see that reflected in how I've built the terrain specifically for this. It's you go, I go. So the player using the with the pike and shot will move first. Pike, I can move them up from this grid. They have a move of 2. Most of your foot, all of your foot will have moves of 2. Your cavalry and your fast-moving screening dogs here will have moves of 3. So we will say that our pikemen want to move up and intercept the risk of the riders coming in. 1 over here. You can move on the diagonal. And 1. And actually, I am going to keep my shot, I believe. I'm going to keep them right where they are. But I'm going to move because movement is governed by the grid, but you can move wherever you want in these squares. Here we're using 4-inch squares with 1.5-inch circular bases. But line of sight, cover, terrain, etc. is not. So I want to make sure that I'm not blocking my own line of sight by keeping my pikemen blocked out here. So I want to make sure that my shot has space there. Okay, I've moved all my units, and then the next player would take over. So the second player with the riders and the dogs, only one base of the dogs, and the riders are there. Oh boy, this is I was hoping I'd get those dogs back. So what I'm going to do is I am actually going to play this entirely cowardly. I am going to make an end run around with my riders here. They have a move 3. As I said, we can move in all directions, all adjacent zones, as we call them, or the squares of the grid. So what I'm going to do is this is actually kind of nasty now that I think about it. 1, 2, 3. I'm just going to have them peel off straight there. For the purposes of this video, I'm not going to have my shot in the trees react with defensive fire, or opportunity fire, rather, as one of the reactions you can take. Just know that that's a possibility. But the reason I'm not doing that, if you recall, I only had 2 initiative tokens to spend, and I spent them all bidding to go first. And I tell you what, I squandered that bid, as you can see. So they're unable to react anyway. They were too busy trying to take the initiative. So I've moved my cavalry out. What I'm going to do now is, with the remaining dog base I have, is I am going to, let's see here, they can also move 3. 1, 2, 3. So there are 2 things I could do that make the most sense right now. One is I could have the one base of the dogs follow the cavalry. However, that potentially introduces problems of unit cohesion when and if the dogs return to the table. Secondly, I could take advantage of the 2 markers I have here. So one of the ways you score points in the game, and one of the clearest paths to victory, is accumulating loot. And as I mentioned at the top of the video, it's not a matter of also just identifying loot that might be scattered around the battlefield, and I'll demonstrate that in a moment, but also the casualty markers function as loot as well, in the sense that if it was your opponents, you would be scavenging what you could, but then if it was your friends and allies, you would want to get them off the battlefield as well, both their equipment, but then, their bodies as well. So I think what I'm actually going to do is, in place of a movement action, I can take up a loot marker. And so if you're familiar with games like Frostgrave, it functions similarly to that, in so much as we're just going to grab it and make sure we clearly attach that marker to the dog unit, the base there. And then that's my movement phase from both sides. So both sides have had a chance to move, and then we move on to the action phase. In the action phase, every base gets a chance to have one single action. So it's not multiple actions, you're not daisy chaining things. The only daisy chain that happens is if you react to your opponent, if you have an initiative token to spend. However, we're going to go into the action phase. What I'm going to do is to continue talking about this idea of loot. And so one of the actions that you get, there's 8 different actions that your bases can take on their turn. You have your classic charge and enter into melee as 2 actions. You have giving fire, so shooting. But then one of the actions you have is this thing called spot. And that's the idea of being able to find hidden enemies, and we'll demo that in a second, but then also find where there might be loot or treasure hidden around the battlefield. And so the way this works is that treasure tokens for standard games are not laid out in advance. They are found generatively as the game progresses through this spot mechanic. And so the way spot works is that a base may attempt to uncover and identify and find loot from the surrounding terrain. So it has to come from where terrain is. However, because raids and these skirmishes were chaotic affairs, it's not a guaranteed thing, and things might be covered with dust and detritus, especially when you are holed up in a cannon-blasted building like we have our shot here, if you can make them out at the distance from the camera. So the way a spot roll works, as we talked about, all the rolls in the game are an X versus Y structure. X is going to be your relevant party stat, which is the number of, again, the number of D10s you roll versus a target number. All of your group level stats are target numbers, with the exceptions of things like move and load, which are, single digit numbers about capacity and how far you can move. But the ones that are part of your rolls and your checks are always going to be target numbers. So your spot action, the roll you make there is experience versus wits. So our pike and shot guys at a party level, they have experience of 3. They're pretty solid, been in a scrap or 2 guys. So that means I get to roll 3 dice, and the wits value of my shot is a 2. So we'll see if I get better luck this go round. However, every action you get, we've deliberately designed the list of modifiers to be very simple, to be very straightforward. You're not going to be combing through long lists of offsetting bonuses and modifiers. The only modifiers in the game are very straightforward, and we hope will be easy to remember, is that every action you have a specific criteria that gives you a +1 bonus. And when you read a +1 bonus, what that reads as, what that means is an additional die, +1 die. And for the spot roll, the bonus is if the base making the roll did not move in the previous movement phase, which they didn't, if you recall. They stayed put in that corner. So that means I could add my 4th die. 4 dice is the maximum you will be rolling throughout the game. So you're going to be rolling a dice pool of 1 to 4. And this is the largest die pool you can roll. And because I'm rolling against wits, I've got to have a score of 2 or more. Which, hey, looky there, I actually pull off. There's a 1. So I have successfully found out where there's some loot we can get away with. So I'm going to take a loot marker. Here I have based and painted up a couple. You'll see that all of my secondary kind of status markers are on 1-inch round bases. All of the groups themselves are set on an 1.5-inch base. And then I have what we call strong points. So you can take, in lieu of one of your groups, instead of it being troops and men and sometimes animals, you can also take what we call strong points. So a redoubt or a bastion of some sort, site, or an altar, or just a cache of supplies that will give you benefits as well. So we have successfully rolled for loot, and we're going to place the loot marker anywhere in the central 10 squares on terrain. And we can also place it in the same zone we're in because we're in one of those central 10s. So I'm just going to place my loot marker right there. However, they don't get to pick it up. They went through the movement phase, stayed put. Their action was to spot that loot. So that loot is out there in the open and anyone can pick it up if they want. So that's an example of how the spot mechanic works. Then I'm going to have my shot here. Like a lot of skirmish games, this assumes 360-degree visibility. You can pivot and turn and face on your action phase if you'd like. It's really just for presentation. It doesn't impact the gameplay, so I'm not going to move them because I have them nestled up in the trees right now, and I don't want to upset the placement there. However, they are going to turn around and give fire. So this is an example of how the range combat works. Again, it's built on the X versus Y rolls, like everything else you do. Here we have a distinction to make that because this is such a small physical space, even at scale, you can shoot across the board if you want. There's no range limitations, maximum range. However, how the shooting mechanics work is you have two values, two target numbers. One is if you're in point blank range, and one is if you're outside of that. You're going to have different scores based on your traits and equipment. For the purposes of our arquebusiers, they have a point blank score of 3, and because it's an arquebusier and a caliver, further range comparatively to the large heavy muskets. They also have a at range score of 3, but if this was a musket, that would be different. So when I say point blank, that's a mechanic you'll see pop up a lot, and that is just within 2 zones or within 2 squares. So if we figure that our shot are within this zone here, our riders are within that 2 square point blank range, because that 2 square point blank range encompasses a fair chunk right here. So they're going to be rolling point blank. That doesn't change anything given their specific stats. And the give fire roll is supply. So this idea of, how well supplied, how well kept are your arms, how reliable are they, do you have the bullets, do you have the powder? And that wasn't always the case for everybody. But for the purposes of our friends in the pike and shot, unfortunately, they don't. They have a score of 1 of supply. So I'm going to be rolling a single die, and I need to roll a 3 or under. However, again, this is another example of how the bonus mechanic works. The bonus for giving fire is if the target is not in terrain, which our riders aren't, and if their entire base is within line of sight, which they are, they're out in the open, you get a +1. So that means, luckily, I'm going to be rolling 2 dice, and I need to score 3 or less. Oh, that's a 9 that went flying off the table, and an 8. So our riders escape. Lucky for them. So our riders have escaped. Our shots have moved. Our pike moved out to the front, thinking that the riders were going to come right at him, and the riders have moved around. So let's make some sense here of what I should do there. So I don't like the fact that my shot are exposed out there in the open. So what I'm going to do is, again, because you have a wide variety of actions, kind of giving you that narrative flavor of the skirmish that's unfolding between small groups of men, is I am going to have them make a rally action. And a rally action is rally to me, reform on me, come to our aid, help us out, get over here, you're in a bad spot. So what it is free movement for an allied base. Really, it's free movement for all bases in a zone. In our case right here, we just have 1. So to do that, it is, again, X versus Y. To rally, it is experience versus prestige. Prestige is another one of the group stats that, depending on how well known, where they were in the social hierarchy, generally as a category, you're going to have higher prestige. However, when you are a common foot soldier, when you're slogging it through the bad stuff, your prestige is pretty low. So our bases of the foot have a prestige score of 2. However, because they're experienced, they've got an experience of 3. So I'm going to be rolling 3 dice and hopefully coming in a 2 or less on one of these. Oh, not so much. A 5, a 7, and a 3. Well, let's see here. So I could rally again. My pike don't have for my second base, because all bases get to be given an action. They can't give fire. Boy, I've made a strategic mistake here in what I'm going to do And I can't charge because charge is based on where you start. Well, let's give another rally. Be real, see if we can do anything better. So my second base of the pikemen will attempt to rally their friends in the trees back over because they're about to get mowed down. Oh man, oh that's cocked. 2, hey, there we go. I finally pull it off, and it takes 6 dice to be able to do that. So they successfully get the attention of the shot, who can then move up to their movement value towards the zone that the rally was made from, the base that rallied. So the shot, like other footmen, have a move of 2, but they only need to move 1, and they move into that zone. Now we have an interesting scenario where all 3 units are in a single zone. That's the maximum number of units that you can have in a single zone. And so we're working on resolving how you move into combat if a zone is full. Currently one of the things we're playtesting, by the way. But fortunately, we won't see that played out here. So that concludes the action round or phase for the pike and shot units. Now we'll move over to the rider and the dogs. So oh boy, that actually saved the shot's bacon, I think, because the riders have only point blank weapons. They have to get up and close and personal with those pistols. However, they've already moved. The shot were able to escape because the pikemen wisely rallied them away. And so now we're going to see the opposite of the rally effect happen. Just in a way that you can rally your own bases to move closer to you. This actually gets really nasty now that I think about it. This actually is pretty funny. There's a counter ability called Parlay. And what Parlay does, taunts, insults, flattery, begging, pleading, commanding, voice instructions, this idea, the back and forth, trying to command the battle space without resorting to violence, is represented with the Parlay action. And how Rally could move your own units, Parlay does the opposite of that. It forcefully moves your enemy units based on its own. So, if a base has line of sight, which they do through the gap here, to the zone and 2 bases in the zone, which they've got line of sight to the back 2 right now. They don't have line of sight to the shot that skedaddled over here from the rally, but they can see the 2 pike. What they're going to do is make a zeal versus prestige roll and try and get them to move. Get out of there. Get going if you know it's good for you. The bonus for Parlay is if there are more groups in play on the board from your party than your opponents, which is not the case. It's 2-2. And so, Zeal versus Parlay. The Zeal for these guys is 2. Their Prestige is 4. Because cavalry have a fair amount of prestige in this time period. So we've got to roll under 4s. We got a 2 and an 8, so we do. So Parlay is really, in a lot of ways, an example of combat. An example of an attack. When you make an attack, whether that's a social attack like parlays, whether that's giving fire, or whether that's a melee action. Which I immediately realized that as the shot moved, I could have spent one of my 2 initiative tokens to countercharge and chase them down, but I didn't, and that is the struggles of remembering your own rules. But to go back to this idea of attacks, whenever you have a successful attack made against you as a base, so here we'll have both because this affects all the bases in the zone that you have line of sight on, you can make a defensive roll. And so to defend against the parlay, or this idea of sticking to your guns, holding fast, and not moving, is you will make a defensive roll, which in this case is supply versus prestige, or this idea of We know what we have. We're going to hold on to our stuff, and we're not going to give an inch. And so, as we've already established, the supply rating for the pike and shot guys is pretty low. It's just a 1. And their no prestige, because they're just lowly foot sloggers, is a 2. So it doesn't look real good for me right now. The bonus for defending against a parlay is the same as the bonus for a parlay. If you have more of your groups, there's more of your party, there's more of your dudes than your enemies, then you feel more confident. It's what that represents. Because it's at par, no bonus. So I'm just rolling a single dice that I need a 2 or less on, because it's always roll low. Doesn't look really good for me for either one of these. So for this base, that's a 6. Oh boy. And then a 10. Ah, yep. So both bases, both groups of the pikemen get rattled. They know that the rider's coming for them, and they're gonna skedaddle out of there. So force movement away from the base that is making the parlay, that's making the threats, and it is to their move value. So I think we know we've got the dogs over here, and the dogs might be coming back next round. So I think what that means is the most logical thing is they're gonna turn tail and 1, 2, and the other one's just gonna follow right along. 1, 2. Hey everybody, we're getting out of here. You should do the same. So that leaves our pikemen exposed. However, that's the end of the actions. For our rider, our dogs, they picked up one of the casualty markers in lieu of moving. So what they are going to attempt to do is hide. That they know that they've got some scary dudes with guns bearing down on them. And so what the hide... 1, 2, 3. No, I can't. I can't reach them anyway with a counter charge, because you can sick the dogs on people. However, you have to have line of sight, and by the time, well, even now from here to here, there's no line of sight. So this is an interesting example of some terms you can't use your initiative tokens on reactions, but I probably could have invoked a motivation or reputation roll to succeed or fail. But let's talk about hiding. Hide is one of the actions you can take, and our friend with the dogs and the casualty marker that he has picked up as loot is going to try and do that. So your hide roll is experience versus wits. So for our dogs, they've got wits of 2 because, well, they're good boys. They're the goodest boys. They're well trained, but they're still animals. So wits of 2. Their experience is 2. So I'm going to be rolling 2 dice. The bonus for hiding is if you are out of line of sight and or are in terrain. And so right now we are fully out of line of sight of any of our enemies. The shot here, these guys, nobody can see them hidden behind there. I don't think. For the purposes of our conversation, we're going to say they can't see around the corner there. So that means I could add that +1. So I'm rolling 3d10, trying to score under 2. Woo! Well, that's kind of cocked, but that doesn't matter because I rolled a 2 here. So when you're hidden, and we're currently working out if we need to introduce a dedicated marker for that or if it's easy enough to remember. But while you remain hidden, you cannot be targeted by the enemy. Unless it's incidental kind of zone-based area, artillery or gunfire or whatever, grenades. But you remain hidden, so basically it's easier to kind of haul out of there if you need to, which is probably something you want to do with the loot you have in play. So that gives us actions for both sides with a lot of commentary from me. And so I think you can see that if I was just going to play the game rather than walk you through the decisions and the options and how the rules work, it actually ends up playing pretty fast. So at this point, we would circle back to the top of that 3-phase cyclical set of phases and go back to the initiative phase. And so right there, we would start by removing any bases that have taken casualties, which we haven't had any. And then we would take a look and make the roll for returning to the fight. And we will say if we made those rolls, we would see our dogs hop in from the table edge that they left. And then we would assemble our initiative tokens based on the groups we have left and bid again. And then move again into the movement and action phases. So that's an example of how a larger round works in 15XX in the current playtest. There's still those fun rough edges we're trying to work out in those edge case scenarios. And all in all, we hope is that it provides some fun narrative experiences of putting ourselves into the shoes of these bands of raiders and marauders and pillagers in the late 1400s through the middle of the 1600s, where men on horseback, still in heavy armor, faced off against big pike squares and men with rapidly developing firearms in a torrent and a maelstrom of chaos that was endemic across Europe at this time. And so I think it's, as I said, it's a really interesting slice of history, but we also hope that the narrative aspect of the rules will allow us to really see through the experiences that men had 400 and 500 years ago that were in these scenarios. And I think that's a really compelling story to tell. So if you are interested in historical wargaming, if you're interested in skirmish gaming, if you are just a history nerd and have wanted a new hobby of miniature gaming, have been always kind of curious about that, then reach out, connect with me. Looking forward to sharing this game development journey with you all.